Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining our webinar today. We're going to be covering ransomware and rethinking your DR. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A box on the lower right of your screen, and we'll get to the questions either during the presentation or real time. Presenting today are Steve Racing, President and CEO of ASMGI, and Frank Yako, CIO and Director of Strategic Initiatives for ASMGI. So without further delay, take it away, Steve.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. I really appreciate you sharing your time with us. What an awesome topic, and just really relevant as we all deal with the ransomware, and we're all working from home, so it's even more challenging than before. But it's a great topic, and I want to emphasize we're bringing a tremendous amount of expertise to the table today, and we have a lot of material to cover. So we're going to try to move through some of it pretty quickly, but I want to just start by, saying thanks to Frank and introduce Frank Yako, my guest speaker for today. Thanks for being with us, Frank, ASMGI CIO and Director of Strategic Initiatives. Yeah, appreciate having you here.
Yeah, thank you. This is a great topic, like you mentioned, so looking forward to it.
And I know you've had to deal with this in a lot of things, but let me just mention what we're going to talk about, and we'll do a brief introduction. I want to just talk about ransomware in general a little bit, and then we're going to dive in from a topic standpoint and cover what's the cost of ransomware. We have, again, a lot of slides that are, I'll say, statistical in nature, so we'll probably move through them pretty quickly. How does it happen? So what does an attack look like, and what are the ransomware, what are the bad guys really doing when they get to your network, and those kind of things. And then we want to spend some time on how do you prevent it, or at least lessen the likelihood of it occurring. And if it does happen, how do you recover from it? I think there's a lot of value in that part of the conversation, and then we'll just kind of wrap everything up with a summary and some key takeaways. So just to get us started, I personally went through a bit of I'll say a recalibration process in the way I think about ransomware, and I can honestly say that I was really adamantly opposed to paying ransoms, and it occurred to me at one time that it's really a business decision, and I think it shifted the way that I think about it, Frank. I went from just being very principle oriented about don't do it because it's a bad idea to pay the bad guys, and I'm pretty sure everybody already knows that, right? But what occurred to me is, fundamentally that might be true. However, paying the ransom or not paying the ransom, it's really a business decision. And there are certain situations where it makes more sense, probably from a business perspective. Historically, if you don't have a way to recover, you kind of got to pay the ransom. And so just kind of looking at it that way, I think one of the things that we decided at ASMGI, like our job is to put our customers in a good situation, right? And don't ever put them in a situation where choosing to pay the ransom is the best choice, right? It's the best business decision. Any thoughts on that, Frank?
Yeah, we totally agree with that, and that's really part of this session today, is just to enlighten everyone on what some of those options are, so you can position yourself to not have to pay the ransom. But at the same time, going back to your point about being a business decision, organizations might choose not to invest in the technology or solutions that are required to prevent them from being affected by ransomware. So again, it ultimately becomes a business decision on where to invest.
Yep, I agree. There is a decision tree, I think, and if you kind of step down through this, we can see that there are some places where, like if your backups are encrypted or removed, right? If that's true, then, if it's not true, you don't have to pay the ransom. So, end of story, right? But if it is true, then you got some other decisions to make, right? So do you have another copy of the backup, right? Do you have a mechanism in place to be able to recover from this type of incident? And if the answer to that is, if they're not available, then paying the ransom again becomes a better choice. But if you step through this decision tree, I think it makes sense, and in all cases, it really ties very closely to the ability to recover. And if your business, as a business, if you don't have the ability to recover, you have to pay the ransom, and it becomes a business decision from that perspective. So So what is the real cost of ransomware? And I think, from a first topic, a lot of this is statistical in nature, and these things, a lot of this information is available on the public internet, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time. But one of the things I just wanted to mention, so the two very recent breaches that included ransomware, right? That's ransomware attacks. But UHS, in the US, there's 400 health systems, and they got hit. They got hit with ransomware, and so we haven't seen the complete ramifications of that and statistics on that, but huge implications, right? So when you think about healthcare, it's impossible not to think about this health system in Germany. They just got hit with ransomware, right? And so a lot of health systems, when something like this happens, they divert all their incoming patients. All their systems are down, so they divert incoming patients to other hospitals. In this particular case, in Germany, a woman died, right? And ransomware is the reason for that. So I think it's worth thinking about the fact that it's not just dollars and cents, right? There are some real the stakes can be pretty high when it comes to ransomware, and just some other things in general I'll say about the topic. But Cybersecurity Ventures predicts that it's $6 trillion by 2021. There's a huge amount of cost, right? So again, I'm not going to go through all this information, but if you look back a year, probably a couple other cases that were really well known, the city government cases of Baltimore and Atlanta, right? So the reason I thought this was important to highlight a couple things as it relates to cost, Frank, were the ransomware demand was $76,000 in the case of Baltimore, but the total cost to recover was estimated at $18 million, right? Huge difference. You can see that paying the ransom is only a portion of the cost. The same with Atlanta, right? $52,000 of ransom to pay, $17 million for the city to recover from that. I mean, that just kind of, in my mind, just really solidifies how detrimental this could be to a business, right?
Yeah, and that
Frank,
doesn't include that doesn't include productivity. It doesn't include brand impact. The ultimate ripple effect of all these events, and
right,
there's certainly
right. And I think that, yep, that's absolutely correct. Yeah, and I think that's what is really being represented here. Paying the ransom is only one portion of the cost. There's all those indirect costs as it relates to reputation and those kind of things that are considered when you calculate the total cost to an entity, right? Legal fees, reputation, all those things, and recovery, right? The other thing I think that people don't recognize sometimes is that once you pay the ransom, you still have to decrypt all the files, right? So there's manpower required. It's not magic, right? You don't just pay the ransom and everything goes back to the way it was. You have a lot of work and cleanup efforts to do, and you definitely don't want it to happen again, right? So KnowBe4 has a study, and again, it's public information, but it's just specific to industries, what the average ransom, again, this isn't total indirect costs or any of that, it's just the ransoms, right? But if you look at it, you can see that, we hear a lot about ransoms in the $5,000 to $10,000 range, but I think this is critical information. The cost, the ransomware bad guys they just want to make money, right? So they're vested in looking at different ways to increase the amount of money that they make on each case. So some average costs specific to industries based on this, they're all around $100,000, right? So you can see that. And then, some of the public information that I was able to get, and again, all these things came right out of the Sophos State of Ransomware 2020 report. So any of you can find that information. But the total cost, and again, this is a global study, but there's a big difference between the ransom fee that is paid and the total cost of a ransomware attack. And I think that's what, I really wanted to highlight with this information. $500,000 for small businesses between 100 and 1,000 employees. I mean, that's a material amount of cost. A lot of businesses cannot sustain a hit to their business of that much money, for sure. And then the other key point, I think, from a cost standpoint is just that, based on 5,000 global people that were interviewed for this study, the total cost of the ransomware, it doubles if you include the ransom. Like if you pay the ransom, the cost is double. And again, it just highlights that paying the ransom is a small portion of the fees for sure. So, and then again, just the things to highlight, I think an important point that I learned in this from looking at some of the information that was available, cybersecurity insurance. So a lot of people have it, and contractually to do business today, a lot of times it's a requirement, right? But know what's in your policy, right? 20%, 1 in 5 people who have cybersecurity, it doesn't cover ransomware, right? So a lot of people have cyber insurance, and ransomware is a big part of it, and they're leveraging their insurance to pay ransoms and pay a big portion of those indirect costs. But 1 in 5 companies, they have insurance. They're paying for cyber insurance, and ransomware is not even covered. I mean, it's just mind-boggling when you think about it. Just take the time to look at those things. In the U.S., it's a little bit less than that, 15%, right? 90% of the people have cyber insurance, 75%. It's mind-boggling when you think about it in those senses. So, anything to add from a cost standpoint, Frank, before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is as impactful to a business as a natural disaster, and in those scenarios, most organizations do the due diligence to go through and make sure that they have the proper coverage. They know how they'd recover from some type of scenario like that, and this is no different. It could be the difference between a business coming back from one of these incidents or not, depending on how prepared you are or whether you have the ability to financially recover or not. So it's extremely critical, I guess, is really the bottom line.
Yep. And I think that's the key to the cost side, right? There can be significant costs, but treat it like an incident, like any kind of disaster, right? It really needs to be evaluated from that perspective. So how does it happen? This is, I think it's a key area that people need to understand how ransomware attacks unfold, right? And what is it that happens when somebody gets hit with ransomware. So this came from Microsoft's perspective, and Frank, I want to tap into your expertise a little bit on this, but I think the key points that really this highlights is that there's a very regimented set of steps that an attacker has to follow, right, when a ransomware attack happens. And any thoughts on that, or?
Yeah, I mean, the attackers have playbooks. I mean, they know what they have to do based on what the symptoms are of the environments that they're attacking. They know based on the target organization what the typical profile of technology is that they use. So it's very scripted, and then depending on the types of organizations they're going after, or the types of technologies that they identify, they very effectively and efficiently can move through an organization's technology, and in the case of ransomware, cause the problems or encrypt the data. So it's not like they're just poking around and this is an amateur type of profession any longer. Right. I thought there were a couple things that were interesting here. So initial access, this is how they basically compromise your network, right? So it's a step that has to happen, right? If they never get on your network, they can't inflict ransomware upon you. But so these are some common methods. I thought it was interesting that, I thought it was interesting that phishing attacks weren't specifically listed because it's a common portfolio. But one of the things I want to point out is this is for human operated campaigns. But in any event, RDP and phishing are probably the two most popular ways for ransomware for initial access to happen. But once somebody gets on your network, I think the keys to understanding what bad guys do, there's a series of steps. First, they have to get credentials, right? So if you do a phishing attack, you get onto somebody's laptop. If you get admin privileges right out of the gate, you're basically owned by the bad guys, right? But for most enterprises, that's not happening anymore, right? So somebody gets a phishing email, there's a payload that goes onto their laptop, and now the bad guys have infected the laptop and put a payload on it, and they have to go through all these steps, right?
They have to move laterally across your network. They have to try to get credentials to access other systems and those kind of things. The two key points I think that are relevant are that it takes time to do all of these things. So an attacker has to be on your network for a certain amount of time, right? And then the other, I guess, key point, there are a couple of them. One is that there are known indicators. People, threat investigators, they know what it looks like. What are the indicators of compromise, or the IOCs, for bad guys who get on your network and progress from this step to this step to this step to this step, right? There are known ways that they do that. It's by playbook, to your point, right? So I think the two critical points are, one is that it takes time. Dwell time is what that's referred to in the industry. How long is an attacker on your network, right, before they encrypt your data? And if you investigate into the bad guy's mentality, right, they want to get paid. They want to ensure that you're going to pay them a ransom, and so they want the encryption of your files to inflict some pain, right? And so they want to find the valuable data and the things like that, so that you're more likely to pay the ransom. 73% of the time, the bad guys, right, they succeed in encrypting the data. 73% of ransomware attacks. So they succeed, but what that means is that 25%-ish, right, maybe some more that they don't. 24% of attacks are stopped before the data is encrypted. That's great, right? That's ideal. There's no point in paying the ransom if your data is not encrypted, right? 3% of the time, people are asking for a ransom and they haven't encrypted your data, and so anyway, that's an interesting point as well, but it's a different topic really than ransomware. It's mostly about encrypting your data. But what we have found is that the bad guys are getting smarter, right? So not only do they encrypt your data, but they also exfiltrate your data and post it on the public internet, right?
Yeah, in some cases, that's even a bigger threat than the encrypted data, depending on the sensitivity of the data in question.
That's right. That's right, because there can be, and particularly if you're in a regulated industry, from a compliance standpoint, there might be fines and all those other things associated with the public release of data, of your sensitive data.
They demonstrate that they truly have it.
Right, right. So all of those things happening, 26% of ransomware victims get their data back by paying the ransom. So we can talk all day long about it being a bad idea, but 26% of the people are doing that because they're making a business decision to do that. And it might not be a bad business decision, but a lot of times I think these are people that have cybersecurity, and the insurance company is going to pay the ransom, and they're making that decision. They're saying, hey, here's the cost of paying the ransom. Here's the cost of doing it yourself some other way. And sometimes the cost of paying the ransom is less. So it's who's to say if it's a good or a bad decision at the end of the day. So, but that's, I thought it was an interesting stat. 94% of the organizations get their data back, right? So 94%, almost 100% of victims who are inflicted with ransomware recover from it. But 56% of it is using backups, right? So that's an interesting stat as well. And again, these are just stats, but so they're all available publicly, but there are some key points, and this is one of them. And I think that people have to understand that I hear a lot from, well, my backups are in the cloud or these kind of things. And just by virtue of that alone doesn't ensure that you're not going to get ransomware, right? That the data that's in the cloud isn't going to get encrypted, because I think that can still happen, and it does oftentimes happen. So before we get into the how do you present and recover from it, Frank? Anything to reflect on as far as how it happens?
Yeah,
what the bad guys are doing when they get on your net?
Yeah, I mean, as far as why it happens, I mean, just like anything, there's a certain amount of preventative activities that could or should be happening, depending on the status of an environment. Maybe an organization has not gone through a refresh of technology for some period of time, so there's a potential that there is exposures or vulnerabilities that might exist, or if there's not a vulnerability management program in place to identify where those potential vulnerabilities are. Those symptoms of a potential looming problem or exposure. The other is to have had, in some cases, maybe you did an acquisition and haven't gone through and done a due diligence process or standardizing or integrating that organization's technology into the standards that you might have established. So there's definitely all types of factors that could come into play to increase, unfortunately, the exposure or vulnerabilities that you have, depending on your business, model.
Yep. I went back to this slide, Frank, because you hit on something that I think is important for people to know, that, vulnerable, and one of the initial access methods is vulnerable internet-facing systems. And the blocking and tackling of cybersecurity is critically important, right? And vulnerability management is one of those things. So we've done some webinars recently that really highlighted some of these things, but doing intelligent vulnerability management, it's hard, right? It's hard. One thing is to know that the vulnerabilities exist, and the other thing is to actually remediate them and fix those problems. But the bad guys, they're automating. What was interesting, and I think really solidifies this, APT-29, which is a Russian cyber group, right? They're sophisticated enough to be given an advanced persistent threat label, right, by various different global organizations. They use commercially available vulnerability scanners to automate scans of the public internet and find vulnerabilities like RDP ports open or whatever the vulnerability may be. Known attacks, 99% of data breaches happen from known attacks, right? So they find a vulnerability, they already know how to exploit it, they just leverage that and boom, they're in, and then they start doing all these other steps, right? But the first step is they have to be able to get onto your network and compromise your network. And I think it's a viable point that if you do the basics, you're probably protected, 99% of the time as it relates to most data breaches. So I think it's a very valid point. So let's talk about how do you prevent it and or recover from ransomware, right? So there's a few different stats that we're going to talk about when it comes to the summary discussion, but I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how do businesses prevent this from happening, or at least lessen the likelihood of it happening. And if it does happen, how do you recover from it? So so we're going to talk about some specific ways and solutions, I think, and then recap this in the summary and the key takeaways part. But I want to highlight that a lot of times the attacks are happening because of blocking and tackling, and people don't even know that it's happening, right? So one of the ways right out of the gate, I think, that companies can really put themselves in a better position is to have 24/7 eyes on glass, right? To be watching for indicators of compromise right out of the gate, and to just know if something bad happens, right? This is I think it's a huge thing. And it really, there's a whole category of solutions around MDR to address this problem, but I think it's a huge, it can be a huge benefit to companies just to have that. What do you think, Frank?
Yeah, because I can't cite the specific statistics, but it's interesting how many attacks actually start on like Friday afternoons or over the weekend or in the off hours when presumably if you are just have a 5x8 or not a around the clock operation, the bad guys know that that's the case, and if you don't have that constant monitoring, that just leaves you exposed for that inevitable attack.
Yep. Yeah, I definitely agree. I think a lot of ransomware attacks happen at 5 p.m. on a Friday. So if you're a bad guy and you know that your target is going home for the weekend and is not going to be there, and you also know that it's going to take you some time to go through step 1, step 2, step 3, right? To find the valuable data and navigate through their network. Is there a better time than Friday evening to really do an attack?
Or they know your business cycle, and if you're at a critical time of the year, if
you're breaking up, Frank. You're breaking up. Can't hear you, Frank.
Any better?
That's much better. Yeah. That's not. Can't hear you. Yeah.
Okay.
Can hear you when you
Go to my phone. Is that any better?
There you go. Yeah, much better.
They understand the business cycles of the.
Nope. You're breaking up again, Frank.
All right, I'll switch over to my computer.
Okay, I'm gonna keep on moving, but I wanted to talk about a little bit, and I'll just mention it while Frank's messing around with those things. One of the things I want to mention is that ASMGI's MDR MSOC Plus program, you know, there are a couple things that we're trying to package together with just standard MDR. And, you know, MDR is basically having 24/7 eyes on glass, and I think that's huge, right? But being able to package with that the incident response piece, I think is a huge thing. So you can lessen the likelihood that an attack occurs significantly with 24/7 eyes on glass, and a lot of intelligence around looking for the right things, right? Indicators of compromise or IOCs, and being able to throw flags whenever they're tripped, and having a team of people that will investigate those and kind of sift through and filter out the false positives, find out if it's a real threat, and really take action on that, right? But the other part of it is just being able to understand user behavior analytics, what's normal behavior, what's anomalous behavior, and if it's anomalous behavior, then make sure that it's being investigated. And response times, right? Quick to action. So one of the things that we're going to talk about, I'll come back to this slide in a little bit because there's some other things I want to highlight, but the average time, you know, so we call it dwell time often. The average time that an attacker is on a network, the average time is 206 days. It's almost 7 months, right? And then if you add cleanup from remediation, taking an average of 73 times, right? There's a huge amount of, again, total at-risk time. This comes from the IBM Pokemon report, but there's a huge amount of at-risk time that enterprises are still at risk with attackers on their network. And if it takes an attacker some time to find the valuable assets within your organization, that's a huge thing. Part of MDR MSOC and having people watch it, and, you know, having tripwires for IOCs going off, is to be able to identify these things way earlier than that, right? So even like within an hour, that's, you know, our SLAs are an hour, right? But a lot of times we're able to identify it a lot faster than that. And so as soon as an IOC is tripped, threat intelligence people and, you know, really smart people are investigating this and finding out, hey, this looks really bad. So we should take a closer look at this, and or automate, right? So automate using SOAR, security orchestration and automation, automate removing that system from the network or doing various different things. So there are lots of options as it relates to that, but I think it's a critical piece of it, identifying quickly when bad things are going to happen. Wouldn't it be nice if we could prevent malware from happening by catching the bad guys before they have a chance to encrypt the data, right? They don't find the useful stuff. So I think that's one of them. The other thing I want to point out as it relates to MDR MSOC stuff is that Gartner has a maturity model around managed SOC and SOC analytics in general. And some of the tasks that they suggest in their maturity model, doing a SIM, right? So being able to collect and aggregate all the logs. It's more than that today. It's actually being able to automate looking through those logs when you correlate all the events. So putting them in a, you know, in a data lake or a cloud environment, so that you can leverage technology to look through them and just really highlight when things are looking like an attack, right? Having threat intelligence baked into the solution, I think, is a critical port. And doing network traffic analysis. So when somebody does lateral movement across your network, a lot of times you wouldn't be able to detect that because they have already compromised an account or whatever. And, you know, if it's an admin account with privileged access, or if it's my account or Frank's account or somebody else's account, you know, maybe they have permissions to access certain information, right? And so it doesn't look like anomalous behavior, but if you look at network traffic analysis, a lot of times you can see what's going on. So if you correlate a lot of the different events and just understanding what's normal behavior and what isn't behavior and automating some of the response, I think that's a key point. So I wanted to highlight that Gartner's really focused on, making sure that people are doing those things to progress up that maturity thing. Maturity model as it relates to SOCs. Before I go to the backup piece, I wanted to talk about a couple other things and just throw them out there. And we're going to mention these in the summary and the key takeaways. But attack simulation is a great way to understand like where you're vulnerable. So we put controls in place and we say, hey, I got it covered. I've put a control in place. But when you simulate an attack, you actually see where the holes are. And so you understand, I think, more about are your controls effective versus do you have them, right? And so there's a big difference between those two. And a lot of people today, what we find when we talk about a lot of things as it relates to evaluating risk of an organization are about, are their controls effective or are they just there and not really effective? Vulnerability management, again, is a great example of that. A lot of people have vulnerability management programs. They know where the vulnerabilities are. But, we have evidence from historical breach data that says, some of the breaches happened, the vulnerability, the tool that they used to find the vulnerabilities found it, right? But they just didn't get around to remediating it in time. And so, and that's what the bad guys leverage to attack them. So attack simulation can tell you what vulnerabilities, not just what vulnerabilities exist, but which ones are exploitable. And I think that's a critical element of protection as well. And then other things like security awareness and phishing tests. I mean, phishing remains and users remain, a critical attack surface. And just educating them and testing against that is important. And being able to use source solutions to automate a lot of those things. So I wanted to move on to backups a little bit.
One other point.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Frank.
One other point on that, let me know if I'm not coming through or not, but
yeah, I hear you very good.
Is on the incident response piece. Another benefit for using attack simulation is just to exercise your incident response capabilities as well. It's one thing to be able to be aware that something's occurring within your environment or that you have a potential risk. But unless you've gone through and actually exercised those skills and organized the actual organization to respond to those versus react, that can cost you critical time and ultimately money if you're not prepared for those. So that's another advantage of the attack simulation is it truly allows you to do real life scenarios versus even just a paper exercise for validating that you're properly protected.
Yep. No, that's a great point. And I think doing incident response like Tabletop, practicing certain events happening is a great exercise. Anyway, we're going to talk about that in our summary a little bit more, but being able to flex those incident response muscles is critical, and being able to know what to do in the case of an incident. Great point, Frank. Thank you for doing that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about DR strategy. It's a huge part of cleanup from ransomware, right? So, not if, but when, right? 51%, I think, this is one of the stats. 51% of organizations are being hit with ransomware. That's a huge number. And having said that, not if, but when. So being able to clean up from ransomware and being able to put our people in a position where they don't have to pay the ransom, right? Wouldn't it be nice to know with confidence that you could recover from a ransomware incident or any incident for that matter with confidence, right? Wouldn't it be nice to say that with confidence? So what's the challenge with traditional security protocols as it relates to ransomware and traditional backup methodologies? You want to elaborate a little bit on that, Frank?
Sure. I mean, a lot of times backups were actually put in place to prevent from some type of hardware failure, whether that was at a site or even, with physical disk drives or even systems. And so, that certainly served its purpose, but if it was not architected to be isolated from the rest of the environment, make sure that it was not the credentials to access it were not protected, then it ultimately is not going to protect the organization's data and can be an easy target for an attacker to be encrypted. So, again, just like everything, if there hasn't been an effort to look at the initial design of how that backup solution was implemented, what the capabilities of the actual solution are itself, it might be a legacy solution, then you're very vulnerable to potential encryption or attack. So that's just like anything else. You have to refresh the technology. You have to look at what capabilities it has and whether the intent of the design is to actually protect you from a potential ransomware attack.
That's right. That's right. And I think, not to state the obvious, but that's what I really got out of this slide was, ransomware protections, they fail when, malware or ransomware specific payloads can circumvent security training and firewall technologies or whatever the controls may be that are put in place to prevent ransomware. I mean, the bad guys, we know they follow a pattern, right? They steal credentials and they're going to log into systems with a certain credential, right? As an administrator, if they gain privileged access or a known user or a service account, right? If those aren't protected properly. So, they're going to do certain things, and if they're able to do them by virtue of the design or lack thereof, then it's going to fail, quite honestly. And so we see a lot of ransomware. The bad guys they're not just encrypting the laptop. They're finding the valuable portion of the data and encrypting that, right? But not just encrypting the production data, they're also encrypting the backup data. They want to tie your hands. They want you to have to say, I have no options left except paying the ransom, right? So that if we think about it that way, then, and not being in that position means doing things with your recovery and with your backups so that you can recover specific things that the bad guys can't circumvent, right? And so there are a couple things we're going to talk about, but the one point that I want to make, and I'm just going to turn this over to you, Frank, and let you kind of elaborate on some of these different options available. But the one point that I like to make is that disaster recovery is not about backups. Now, you have to architect your backups in such a way that they can't be circumvented. The controls can't be circumvented, but disaster recovery is about recovery, right? And I think if we just stop for a second and think about it that way, then no matter what the disaster is, you have to be able to recover from it, right? So how does that affect ransomware, Frank? And what are the things that people should look at as they architect for a backup solution that allows them or enables them to recover in the event of a disaster?
So there's a number of factors there. So we did have a question come in that was asking about, how often data should be backed up. And they specifically asked about in a cloud environment, but it really is the same answer depending on whether it's an on-prem or cloud-based scenario. That it all depends on the profile of the solutions and the applications that support the business. So if you're a highly transactional business, you might be backing up or even in some cases replicating data and having that in different environments for a high availability type of scenario. So, again, when we talk about disasters, we're really talking about multiple scenarios, and depending on how exposed you are for the downtime associated with any type of disaster, really dictates how frequently you should back up your data and how many copies you should have. Part of a disaster plan includes things like what your recovery time objective should be, what your recovery point objective should be, and that then allows you to drive what your actual architecture is for that. So if you're a highly transactional business, you should have some type of high availability configuration in place. If you're very cyclical from a business perspective and have certain applications that are critical during certain times of the year, or business cycles, again, you should have those architected so that you are not vulnerable to any type of ransomware attacks or DR scenarios. And that includes, as it's shows on the screen, there's different approaches for doing your backup architecture. So there's a one method, the 3-2-1 scenario, is where you have 3 different backup targets. Again, typically those are geographically dispersed in many cases, different mediums that can be used, and also the cloud, because depending on where you're at in your cloud adoption strategy, that may be separate from an on-premise implementation. The other one is the immutable backups. So as we talked about, one of the things that occurs when ransomware hits is your backups are typically the targets for encryption. So there are different technologies out there that have evolved over time, besides write-once storage, that allows you to programmatically or through software control how long a target object is actually or not able to be rewritten, which allows you, again, to synchronize that to your business cycle. And built into that is the ability to detect whether there's any type of potential intrusion going on within your environment. And the ultimate goal is to be able to make sure that if something you do become of some type of incident, that you have the data there to recover from that.
Yep. Yeah, there's so much there, and there's so many options. But I think the one thing that really jumped out from what you just said, and again, if I tie it back to the question that came in from the audience, like how many times should I do a backup? The answer is it depends. But I think if you look at RPOs, right? So part of a disaster recovery or business continuity or business resiliency exercise would be establishing what's a reasonable RPO for your business. And RPO stands for recovery point objective, and that's how far back your data should go, right? So if your RPO is a day, then you only do backups once per day, and that's consistent with that, right? But if your RPO is 5 minutes, then you have to make sure that you do a point in time snapshot every 5 minutes, right? And so theoretically, from a ransomware perspective, if the bad guys encrypt your data, you should be able to go back to a point in time any time prior to that, right? So RPO becomes how long prior to that event, right, that encryption event, would you have to go back to recover your data? And I think it's important that businesses look at it this way. So there are cost implications, right? Every business decision is economic in some way, shape, or form, right? It always comes up. So if the cost of a solution is really high, a lot of businesses are not doing those things. But if the cost of a ransomware attack is a lot higher than the cost of doing a solution, then you should probably do it, right? So I think it depends on a lot of different factors, right?
It does tie back to the whole business driving the actual approach. If you can cost justify the reason why you have to invest in a certain architecture or even a high availability type of scenario, and demonstrate how that supports the business, then it really is a non-factor when it comes to the actual cost component.
Right. I used to have this little story that I told about most enterprises when they said they wanted to do a DR solution, they want real time, right? I say, how much time can your business tolerate being down? And they would say none, 0, right? And I'd say, okay, here's what that looks like. And it can get pretty expensive to do active and various different things, particularly for larger enterprises. But a lot of smaller businesses and mid-market companies were saying, okay, well, maybe it wouldn't be so bad if I'm down for a week, right? But today with ransomware, if the bad guys go encrypt your data, we're seeing a lot of recovery time. Some people it takes them 2 weeks to get back online, right? Most businesses today can't really be down that long. They take a huge hit. And again, the indirect costs of a ransomware attack, the reputation and those kind of things, it can be material. So, one of the points
to the hospital example, that truly is life or death in some of those instances, depending on what systems are impacted. So, that's where it's even more relative.
Yep. So I want to talk about testing your DR plan, right? So and we do a lot of third-party risk exercises, and I use this example a lot because third-party risk used to be about saying, do you do DR, right? And everybody would say yes, pretty much inevitably, right? Or do you have a DR policy? And then it was, can you show me your DR policy? And now it's, do you do a test of your disaster recovery, right? So can you prove to me that you're able to recover in the event of disaster? And this is huge. It's a huge part as it relates to ransomware and being able to recover effectively, from a ransomware attack. So I just wanted to mention that. I don't think we have to elaborate it on a whole lot, but it's critically important not just to put these steps in place, but also to test that they actually work. So there are two byproducts of that, or two outcomes, I think, things that come out of that. One is your people get trained on how to actually do it. So if an incident occurs, right, if a disaster occurs, then you already know and have already practiced the steps to go through. So anything real quick to add to that, Frank,
Yeah, that just goes back to our, reference earlier to the incident response plans and the tabletop exercises and exercising those procedures, because it has to be more than just written on paper. It has to.
Right. And that's exactly where we're going next is, tabletop exercise. This is how you test an incident response plan. And I think it's a critical part of making sure that you're well positioned to be able to recover in the event of any kind of disaster, really. But from a cyber incident, the costs are just going through the roof. So being able to do that. So what I just showed a couple of these are real, right? These are part of tabletops that we've done. And there are all kinds of things that come out of that. But, technically, when you do a tabletop exhibit, you have a slide deck and a bunch of people are involved, and you go through some kind of scenario, and you actually pretend that the scenario is happening and find out what people would do. And sometimes you actually do those things, right? But practice, we always say, is critically important. And I think it's important to understand that there are very specific things that, that you have to do to really garner or extract the right information. And at the end of the day, what a tabletop exhibit is about, in my opinion, is the part about, we call them roses, buds, and thorns, but it's about what went well and what didn't go so well, right? And then everybody has an opportunity to talk about it and really understand and know who the people are that involved and what it is that they're supposed to do, where the information is kept, and all those things. So very, very critical to do that. Let's talk a little bit about some of the things that can happen. There's another question that came in, actually, and we have a couple of questions really that are related to the same thing, and I wanted to get to that real quick. Let's talk about this. On October 1st, the question says, the Department of Treasury's office, the OFAC, basically, Office of Foreign Assets Control, published an advisory and things like that. We actually also had a question, very similar question, come in about, I'll handle them. Are there ethical, legal considerations to paying or not paying vis-a-vis investors, shareholders, customers, partners, or legal implications, right? In this case, as it relates to OFAC, it could be the U.S. government, right? So the question from this one user is, who has responsibility to check whether payments are legal or compliant with U.S. regulations and those kind of things? So I'm going to handle both of those questions together, but I think it's a great point, right? So it's one thing to make a business decision to pay a ransom, but what OFAC is saying, and they just issued an advisory on October 1st of this year, right? So it's very recent information. It's not a new regulation, but it is a new advisory, and so the sanctions list, the U.S. sanctions list, it changes, right? So really, I think businesses have to pay attention. If you pay a ransom, you could be violating a U.S. government sanction against an entity, right? So a lot of the attackers from ransomware are coming from places that may be on the sanctions list, and OFAC as an organization is saying, if you pay them, then you violated our sanction, right? So that's kind of like a double hit, right? So you pay the ransom, and then you get fined from your own government because you paid the ransom, right? Because it's a violation of a U.S. sanction. But the question is, who's responsible for understanding that? And ultimately, the company is responsible, right? But I would say make sure that you have advisors when you have an incident. It's important to have professionals involved that understand the implications, right? So never do anything without legal representation as it relates to ransomware, in my opinion, because particularly if you're in a regulated industry, right? So if there are contractual implications or those kind of things, you want to make sure that you do the right things. And this is, again, it's why incident response is so important, and having a structured approach and making sure you're working with responsible sysadmins. They always want to do what's right for the business. I don't question that, but sometimes it's more about repairing a system than it is about preserving evidence, and that evidence is critically important. So making sure that you do the right steps to preserve data and be able to have log files and evidence of what happened and what you did about it, and various different things. Even understanding what data has been exfiltrated or not may be the difference between, do you have to report a data breach or not report a data breach. It's critically important. So make sure the right professionals are involved. A lot of enterprises, the larger enterprises, have people, a chief privacy officer, for example, or a chief legal officer, people on board who understand these things. A lot of entities that don't have them, right? So make sure you're working with a third-party professional that understands those things. Anything to add to that, Frank?
Yeah, and that's also where leveraging, your network as far as industry associations are a great place as well, because typically there are some types of guidance provided so that everyone doesn't have to reinvent the wheel, and then that can be again because of the prevalence of these types of attacks, many vertical organizations and associations are addressing those types of guidelines and requirements as well.
Yep. I want to step through some of these recommendations about if you do have an event, a ransomware event, what kind of things should you do, or how do you lower the likelihood or prevent it from happening? So number one, I think is critically important, and I start with the assumption that you will be hit, right? 51% in 2020 of enterprises get ransomware. So just assume it's going to happen, right? And I think, having that mentality, and again, not to jinx yourself so that it does happen, but having that mentality will help you put the right controls in place. But if you start with that assumption, it's not if, but when. That's what it basically means to me, that you will be hit with ransomware. Make sure you have the systems in place to recover from it, right? And then the other thing, I think, from a prevention standpoint, is just using security awareness to make sure you're not one of those 51% that does get it, right? Make sure that your users know not to click on links in emails, and make sure you put all those prevention techniques and educate your users and those kind of things. Invest in anti-ransomware technology to stop unauthorized encryption. One of the things I talk about, and I spent a little bit of time talking about MDR and all the ways I think that can help, right? Just detecting early that somebody has violated an IOC or tripped an IOC or those kind of things. I think it's critically important, and hopefully you can stop an event before it happens. 24% of survey respondents that were hit by ransomware were able to stop the attack before it happened. I think that's a great stat, but that's something to celebrate. The 24% stopped it, but part of me wants to say only 24%, right? If more people would do these things, I think we can stop ransomware from happening. And quite honestly, if the velocity of ransomware attacks slows down, attackers are going to find another way that they can make money, right? It'll be less popular, and it's a critical thing when ransomware happens. But protect data wherever it's held and make regular backups and those kind of things. I think we highlighted this on the backup portion, right? But and it was also in the stats, right? I think it's important to understand that just because you put your backups in the cloud, right, it doesn't mean that the attackers are not going to find it. They're going to do everything they can. They're pretty smart and sophisticated in a lot of cases, right? They know how to navigate through an organization. But one of the things that you can put in place to work on backups and be able to making them immutable and being able to recover if you are one of the 51% that gets hit with ransomware is using that 3-2-1 rule on data backups. Maybe tapes are going to come back into fashion, Frank. I think at the end of the day, it's not a bad thing. But let me just kind of file through the rest of them, and then I'm just going to kick it over to you for comments. But cyber insurance, I think this is a critical point to make, right? Make sure you understand what's in your policy. That's what it means at the end of the day, right? Because some people are getting hit with these ransomware attacks, and they find out later that their cyber insurance that they've been paying for all these years doesn't really cover it. It would be nice to know that ahead of time. Make sure it is. That's the message, I think, from this. And deploy a layered defense. I think this is critically important. Again, there are a lot of different things. Attackers make it hard, right? So that's why people put locks on their doors and their windows, right? They make it hard for attackers. If you're leaving your door unlocked, you know, metaphorically, as it relates to ransomware, people are going to just open it, right? If you're locking your doors and making it difficult for them, now they have to actually break a window, not walk through the door. And I think it makes a big difference. But we can use attack simulations to test our layers of defense and find out if anything is working or isn't working, right? That's, I think, a huge benefit for organizations today. So Frank, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I think all these points are excellent. And, you know, if you know, for all of our listeners, if you were to use almost this as a checklist for how you've addressed or are prepared for each of these items, it's probably one, you know, good takeaway from this, because you know, again, going back to my earlier comments about how your technology might have been architected, how your applications and solutions are architected, you know, maybe they haven't taken into account all these different factors, and you know, again, things change so quickly. You know, it's just important to do this you know, type of activity on a regular basis, so you understand what your current state is, you know what you are or not exposed to, and then, you know, you can make those recommendations to your organization to, you know, make sure they understand the risks that they're undertaking, and what's involved or what is at risk if there wasn't a potential issue. So, you know, again, with the assumption of assuming you're going to get hit and having that mindset, you know, that puts everything into perspective to highlight the urgency for addressing some of these vulnerabilities.
Yep. So I'm going to toggle to the last slide and go through these pretty quickly so we can have some, get through some of these questions. We have a lot of questions, but I think the key takeaways, if we just summarize everything that we've talked about in the webinar, Frank, just assume that you'll be hit with ransomware, not if, but when. Have multiple data backups. So the 3-2-1 model, I think when you're architecting a backup solution, these kind of things, with a focus on recovery, right? And so the two metrics that we talk about when it comes to recovery are RTO, that's the amount of time it takes to recover from an incident or a disaster, and RPO, how far back you need to go in your data. So how often you need to do backups. Deploy MDR MSOC for early detection and immediate action, I think, is a critical point that people need to understand, right? Stop the bad guys. It takes them time to inflict you with ransomware. They want to do it in a way that really causes pain, and it takes time to do that. Have a detailed, up-to-date incident response plan, I think, is critical. Be prepared, practice with tabletop exercises and DR test plans at least once per year. I think it's absolutely a requirement, and should be if it isn't at your organization, but preferably more than once a year, right? Quarterly. Make sure you have cyber insurance that covers ransomware. And then I do want to mention one last thing before we get to the cyber questions. For those people who request a pass, we have in Cleveland, Ohio. I know our audience is from all over the place, but in Cleveland, Ohio, we have an information security summit every year, the last week in October, and it's coming up soon, right? It's not next week, but the following week, I think.
Yeah.
But you know, that said, it's virtual this year. There is a fee to attend, but the programs are fantastic. ASMGI we have 5 sessions throughout the summit, but if anybody is interested, I'm happy to get you a pass for the summit. So let's move through some questions. Are there any templates, Frank, any playbooks or templates or run books or anything with recommended steps to follow if a ransomware event does happen?
So there are you know, different templates out there for it. It really is, you know, I think the question is related to just incident response in general. So you know, depending on whether you've established an incident response plan in your organization and then have the playbooks associated with that, you know, ransomware just becomes one of the types of incidents that you have to respond to. And you know, I know, you know, it's one of those things where you hate to say it depends, but you know, depending on the profile of the organization, the types of solutions that you have, the types of architecture you support, the technology architecture supporting your organization, really dictates then how you, respond in the case of a ransomware attack. So I can definitely say that there's templates out there. We work with clients directly in developing those plans, and so that they are prepared to deal with those types of incidents, and cater those to their actual organization and their business requirements.
Excellent. A couple other questions that we have. Who is at risk for a ransomware attack? That's a great question. And I'll just do a real quick answer to that, because we're kind of running out of time, but I want to try to get through a few of these. Who's at risk for a ransomware attack? One of the points that we make a lot of times, and Frank, you can chime in on this, but everybody, right? Everybody is a potential victim. The bad guys, they just want to get paid, right? So I do think that there's a trend over the past couple of years that's moving towards larger ransoms, which basically means moving towards larger enterprises as well. So, but it's harder. It can be harder to break into a larger enterprise sometimes. So mid-market companies and small businesses still are not off the hook, right? But I always use the example, metaphorically, Frank. We had a repair shop that told me one time, nobody really cares about my business, right? And that might be true, but you care about your business and your data. And the other thing that I mentioned to this particular person was your largest customer happens to be a very large user of the products that you repair. And maybe the bad guys are leveraging you to get to them. So it's anything to add to that?
Yeah, that's a great point. Is certainly during COVID and everything going on in the world around us, the whole third-party risk, and vendor risk, profile of organizations has been highlighted. And this is just one example where if you have commitments to your largest client, or you rely on organizations that to be consistent in delivering goods or services to you, then it's important to have an incident response plan to be protected from ransomware, because it can have impacts to your clients as well as your organization. And a lot of again, ransomware attacks are being targeted at that supply chain, so that it's not maybe the organization that it starts with, but it's the end organization that is the service consumer of those services from that organization. So that's it's very targeted from that perspective as well.
Yep. We have a lot of great questions, but it's 2:05, and I definitely want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I think it's worth making the mention that we'll send the slide deck from the presentation today out to everybody, so everybody will have it as a reference. And then we'll make sure that we answer all the questions in writing. But if you want to follow up on any of these questions, please reach out to us. We're happy to have a conversation with you, and we can get to your questions that way. Any closing remarks, Frank?
No, just appreciate everyone's time, and just highlighting again, like some of the statistics say, this is a very serious problem. It's real. You should not assume that you're immune, and it's extremely important that you take the steps to prepare for the inevitable. Which again, don't like to look at things as a glass half empty or anything like that. But you have to be realistic about the world that we live in today, and don't be one of the organizations that cannot recover from one of these incidents.
Yep. And I'll just solidify my own personal kind of recalibration in the way that I think. But our job, Frank, I think, is to not put people in a position where paying the ransom ends up being the best business decision for them, right? So,
right.
And it's all about recoverability when you think about it in those terms. So thanks, everybody. Make sure you're able to recover from a ransomware attack. That's the message, right? Thank you very much. Let's close, and we'll follow up with an email and get all these questions answered for you then. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.